We move on to the next paper by Professor Dhurjjati Sarma.
As has been the custom throughout the last Indica conference on Vaishnavism, I shall be giving an introduction in my mother tongue. Namaskar. Indicar উদ্যোগত আয়োজিত তন্ত্ৰ আৰু তন্ত্ৰ সাহিত্য বিষয়ক এই আলোচনা চক্ৰখনত মই এখন অসমীয়া জয়ৰাম দাসকৃত এখন অসমীয়া শীতলা কাব্যৰ বিষয়ে আলোচনা কৰিবলৈ ওলাইছো। It's my pleasure and privilege to be back again with Indica and to speak on the topic, the Localizing the Divine Feminine, exploring the classical folk narrative interface in an Assamese Sitala Kavya. So what I am going to do in the course of my presentation is to talk about the nature, very briefly, about the nature and prevalence of the Sitala cult in Assam, and I'll be taking a particular example of a Sitala Panchali Kavya by Joyram Das, an Assamese poetic text which was possibly composed, the language betrays it was composed sometime around the 18th century. Now what I am going to show in the course of my presentation is that, and this is something also Nagaraj sir had hinted at during his introductory remarks, the impossibility to actually ascertain a trajectory of the movement from like the classical to the folk. So what I am going to argue in the course of my presentation, that the classical, the vernacular, the folk, they exist in a kind of a continuum. They exist in a kind of a continuum and they mutually reflect one another. They are mutually enriched by one another. So this is a process that I am going to show, and I take this Sitala Kavya as an example. Now, in the first part, I'll just try to show how this text actually draws on the classical references and how it actively processes those influence and localizes it within the the Tantra geography, if we can call it the Tantra cultural geography of say Assam Kamarupa, early medieval or late medieval Assam Kamarupa. Now the text is based on references originating from Skanda Purana and Kalika Purana. Obviously there are references to this text, and the padas are composed in various ragas and meters derived from the folk and classical sources. Now in the Skanda Purana, if we move to the Prabhasha Khanda, there is a section called the Prabhasha Kshetra Mahatmya, and there is a section there called Sitala Gauri, which is the greatness of Sitala. There we find this reference in Sanskrit from the Skanda Purana. I won't be reading out the whole thing, but I will just be drawing attention to the stanza 3rd and 4th. I won't be reading from this Sanskrit because of time. I'll just give the English translation, which says that in order to dispel swellings, boils in case of children, masuras should be properly measured and pounded. The same is placed before Sitala, uttering, "May the children be free from ailments. Thereby there shall be suppression of Vishvota, swelling or boils, Sarchika, small boils, etc., as well as Vata, the rheumatic complaints, etc." So this is from the Skanda Purana. In the Pichila Tantra, the deity Sitala is invoked in this manner. I am giving the English translation. "I worship thee, Sitala, who art white complexioned and seated on an ass, who catcheth hold of a broom in thy hands, who restest on a full pitcher, who sprinklest by means of the broom the life-giving water out of the full pitcher in order to alleviate suffering, who are without clothes, who carrieth a winnowing basket on thy head, who art embellished with gold and jewels, who are tree-eyed and who mitigated terrible suffering arising out of painful eruptions. This I have quoted from a source. Then again in the Skanda Purana, in Kasi Khanda, there is a Sitala Dhyana Mantra. I'm again giving the English translation. There is a specific reference to the affliction of fever born out of pustules appearing on the body, and the Shitala Mantra, Dhyana Mantra goes like this. O Shitala, for a man scorched by fever, okay, I think I should move to the next slide. Yes, this is, okay, this was the quote from Pichila Tantra. Okay, this is, O Shitala, for a man scorched by fever, become foul smelling, and whose vision is destroyed, you they regard as the living medicine. Now, an important aspect that gets highlighted from this iconographical description of Shitala that I provided vis-a-vis the Pichila Tantra is her position of a broom and a full pitcher of water, a factor that has clear sociological implications related to hygiene, cleanliness, as well as the day-to-day conduct of an ascetic or householder alike, which is also referred to as charya. So in the course of my presentation, I'll be focusing more on the sociological aspect of Tantra, how it is not something, as has already been shown, not something esoteric, not something overtly ritualistic, but something that could also be a matter of daily practice. And when we talk about the Shitala cult, we find a reflection of this particular lifestyle, it will be shown subsequently. Now this is an iconography, this is a Kalighat painting of Shitala. You can see the iconographical description of the broom, of the pitcher of water, the winnowing, there's a winnowing scoop or a winnower on her head. And usually she is a Digambari, but here she is shown dressed and she's seated on a donkey. Now, unlike the Bengali Shitala Mangal Kavya, which developed into a full-fledged genre, we have Shitala Mangal poets like Krishnaram Das, Harideva and Nityananda Chakraborty, who through their respective versions, they explored various dimensions of the smallpox goddess, as she is referred to, Shitala, along with the varied dynamics of devotion and appeasement associated with her worship in Bengal. But in Assam, so far, though there are many Ainam, there are songs attributed to Shitala, but in terms of a text, I'm here talking about a full-fledged, whether we call it a narrative text or a poetic text, so far we have just this particular text. So the narrative structure of this text is styled according to the conventions of a Panchali Kavya. Now Panchali Kavya is very popular among the Manasa poets. The Panchali genre is popular widely across the country, but in Assam, they are particularly attributed to the Manasa poets like Monkor, Durgabor and Pitambor, who throughout the 16th century, they sang devotional songs dedicated to the Manasa. Now, the text that I am going to discuss differs from its Bengali counterparts in terms of its acquisition of narrative content from the Sanskrit Kalika Puran, which was composed in Kamrupa around the 10th century. Then again, a close interrelationship. I talked about the prevalence of the Manasa cult in Assam. Now, a close interrelationship between the Manasa and the Shitala cult, most specifically in the context of Assam Kamrup, is attested at the very outset of this Kavya, where it is stated that, which describes the birth of Shitala as Monohar Nabhimule Hitala Jonmila. From the navel of Manasa was born Shitala. Now, this is at variance with the description found in one of the most popular Shitala Mongol Kavyas in Bengali by Nityananda Chakraborty, where Shitala is stated to have emerged from the sacrificial fire, where Shitala herself says that Devikon Agnikunde Mama Janma Hoila. So there are differing interpretations as to the birth of Shitala, but in this, I exactly don't know, this is something I submit before the august audience, if they can enlighten me further on this, because I'm trying to explore where could we trace the origin of this connection between Manasa and Shitala. Because in this Assamese Sitala Kavya, we find a reference throughout the text. Manasa is invoked alongside Shitala. Now in Joyram Das's this Sitala Panchali Kavya, now Sitala is endowed with the behavioral practices drawn from the classical sources. Now at the very outset of my paper, I referred to some of the iconographical description of Sitala found in different Puranas and Tantras. Now I'm going to show how this text, this vernacular text, localizes this description within it. Now, the description is also relevant as an indicator of her association with the praxis of Tantra. I'll come to the praxis of the Tantra subsequently. Now, this is mentioned in the Assamese text. If I have time, I'll just read the English translation, looking at the time. That roam around the world disguised as the wind, afflict the humans through the heat of the fever, express your blessings in the form of boils or pustules. Bishphotok name prohat byakta koriba. We find reference to the Bishphota in the reference in the Skanda Purana. In this localized version, we also find reference to Bishphotok name prohat byakta koriba. Okay, this is, everybody can understand this. And thereby acquire deep and sustained worship from the humans in return. But then it again says, Shokhosti yogini gone logote cholok, monushote honte sobe puja boli khaok. May the 64 yoginis accompany you in your sojourns, and all of them receive worship through sacrifice. Right. Now in many parts of the country, particularly in the northern and the eastern parts, Sitala is also seen as the Grama Devata or the Grama Devi, the guardian of the village, where devotees belonging to other sectarian cultures and even other religions. They worship her as a gesture of propitiating her and thereby liberating oneself from her benign or malign influence. Now, the very irony about devotion to Sitala is that if she is happy with you, then it's a problem. If she is angry with you, then it's also a problem. Somehow it's difficult to adequately conceptualize the presence of the goddess around you. We worship her, but possibly we don't want her with us. I'm quoting here from Vidya Dahejia. She says, these village goddesses seem to have been gradually transformed and consolidated into potent numerical groupings, and it was Tantrism that elevated these local deities and gave them new form and vigor as a group of goddesses who could bestow magical powers on their worshippers. Exactly what Nagarasa had said in the introduction. It's how these goddesses are subsequently elevated to the levels of goddesses. So, and possibly if we can argue Sitala as one of the possible yoginis, because there's a reference to Sokosti yoginis. She's also known as Sri Matangi, Vainayaki, Ganeshani, and because she rides a donkey, she's also referred to as the Rashabhashta Sitala. As one seated upon a donkey, an animal which is invested with the Sattva Guna, for its inherently detached and pliable nature. The reference to the donkey is not incidental, it's something highly loaded with meaning. It's because it's invested with Sattva Guna, and we find that the reference to Sattva Guna throughout this particular narrative. This is 18th century. This is an 18th century text. Now as a yogini, Sitala is envisioned within Jairam Sitala Kavya as a Digambari, one who wears the elements, as a Chaturbhuja, four-armed, who holds a marjani, a broom in her hand, and balances a kula, a bamboo scoop on her head. Furthermore, it is stated that whoever is suffering from Bisha Kohu, the pus formation, on the head and whose body has developed foul-smelling festers, Teje Puja Posha Hoya Durgandha Koraya. That person should submit himself or herself to Sitala for recovery from such ailments and afflictions. But then this is not only a prescriptive manual, this also has a devotional element, because it says, however, the text also accords certain inevitability to the subjection of the body to the trials and tribulations of life, since such occurrences are preordained in the course of nature. It says, Joto rugo byadhi hoye horiratha thiti purbatta srajana kori asanta prakriti. It's something that is preordained. It's not something that has happened out of nowhere. It could be the result of your past actions. So whether one is a householder, an ascetic, one is prescribed daily and calendar based rituals. This is where I bring in the sociological implications of Tantra to continue propitiating the goddess not only through ritualized practices but also by means of purifying one's mind by listening to this Panchali Kavya, this particular text. So we can argue that there's also a kind of a self-reflexivity vis-a-vis this text, which is both based on consciousness as well as directed towards sustained labor and perseverance. Hitolako pujebako kori nana kosto. So this devotion is something which has to be carried out through a sustained labor. It shouldn't come easily to you. So it involves practice, austere practices. So this is also indicative, and here I refer to the CFP of the conference, which has emphasized on the manner in which the inward experiential practices are integrated with the external worship practices as evident in the rituals prescribed for the worship of Sitala within various devotional cultures across the length and breadth of the country. Now it is worthy of attention that its iconographical accompaniments of Sitala, the broom, the pitcher of water, or the winnowing fan as we saw in her image, embody a far more quotidian significance, a day-to-day significance rather than an overtly religious or a mythical one. The twin presence of the sweeping broom and the water pitcher also attests the necessity of keeping the setting of the house clean at the time of illness. While this may suggest the process of keeping the patient free from possible infection on the one hand, there's also a simultaneous effort to honor the presence of the goddess within the body of the patient. See, the element of hygiene is reflected not only in the level of cleanliness in the physical sense, but also just because the patient is possessed by the goddess, so she has to be honored. So cleanliness is also prescribed as a ritual in that context, the presence of the goddess within the body of the patient. So it is a kind of a ritual possession by the goddess of the body of the person, and she needs utmost. She needs to be kept happy so that she peacefully lives without causing further damage or illness to the body. Now this winnowing fan is invested with the dual function of maintaining cleanliness and also cooling the fever heat, the jwara tapa, the heat of the fever. So for being used for the purpose of removing the chaff from the grain, the fan, the winnowing fan, also has a symbolic association with the concept of fertility and regeneration, and hence it is used as a ritual object during the auspicious occasions of marriage and childbirth. Now, in the context of various mantras and padas sung in the presence of the afflicted person, the presence of the aforementioned accompaniments could be seen as a folk and a localized therapy, the use of the winnowing fan as a folk and a localized therapy of healing, which has obvious tantric implications. We saw that. So why? Because this body is simultaneously seen as sacred and infected. There is thus an objective towards perceiving the body as here and now, the body as it is, and also beyond the ephemeral. Now a crucial passage, sir, I'll be concluding in about 4 or 5 minutes. Yeah. So a crucial passage towards the end of the Jairam Sitala Kavya firmly contextualizes this text vis-a-vis this mind-body continuum that I'm talking about. About the mind-body continuum is stated in the paragraph above. I'll just read I'll read the original. The Nabhi Komolor maje boshi ase ai, Minalor Lerijen Tontue Merai. Here's a reference to Tontu, as a reference to Tantra, Tontue Merai. Ehi mote homosto horire ase byapi, Sintia Moroyo Noro Nisine Tothapi, Horiroto Bahottori Hajareko Nari, Nari Hoste Byapi ase Joro Pura Kori, শৰীৰৰ কুশলক বাঞ্চে যিটো নৰ শীতলাক ধ্যান কৰিবেক হিতু নৰ হৃদয়ত অষ্টদল পদ্মত থাপিব শীতলাৰ অষ্টনাম তাহাতে জপিব. I'm reading the translation. This is a crucial passage. I'll be reading the translation as well. Mother Sitala is seated amidst the lotus blooming from the navel of Manasa. wrapped around by lotus stems like filaments of tissues. I've done it literally, but we can also think over it. Her presence pervades the whole expanse of the body, yet the humans endowed with the rational faculty of thought cannot discern her presence within the body. Like the presence of 72,000 nadis all throughout the body, the goddess is likewise ever present within the body. Any human being who so desires to ensure the well-being of the body must meditate on the divine presence of Sitala within his or her body. So it's like worshipping Sitala is also worshipping my own body. In a sense, as long as Sitala is there. So the person itself becomes deified, the patient itself is deified. So this Jwara Tapa, I am trying to look at this concept of Jwara Tapa from a very tantric, epistemological, sociological perspective. Now this aforementioned symbolism involving the placement of goddess Sitala upon the Nabhi Kamal, upon the lotus, testifies to the poet's conceptualization of the sage flower of the lotus as a symbol of the expanding consciousness. Oritra, you had talked about the Padma, right? By means of which the devotee is elevated from the dark depths of ignorance to the radiant heights of inner awakening. Furthermore, this pervasive presence of Sitala within the body of the devotee could also be manifested in the form of the lotus blossom, with its closed and unfolding petals representing the network of tissues, the tontue merai, the way it is wrapped around by the tissues. So I'm looking at its out paneling of the lotus, the Padma. The nadis, on the other hand, signifies this outpetaling, to use Kumar's term used in the context of the lotus across the body, of the energy, also symbolized by the fever heat during Sitala's position of the body, generated through meditating on the name of Sitala. So can we talk about this Jwara Tapa, the fever heat, also in terms of an energy, of an inner energy, which signifies her presence within the body? Now the poet explicitly states this phenomenon in the Sitala Kavya. Hidayata ostodal padmat thapiba Sitalar ostonam tahate jopiba. The 8-petaled lotus will be enshrined in the heart of the devotee. Therein he or she will meditate upon the 8-fold hymn of Sitala. Now this state of bliss or attainment, the Shanta Rasa, if we can say, will thus be acquired, which will be signified by an experience of coolness. That's henceforth the name Sitala, Shital, the coolness, which could be both astral as well as physical. Now this poet, Jayaram, claims that the goodwill and benediction of Sitala is the only Tantra Mantra Aushadha for the alleviation of the ailment induced, ironically, by her very position of the body. I'm just coming to the conclusion. Now, even though Jayaram's Das Sitala Kavya is the only extant narrative poem on Sitala, there are, however, songs which are transmitted orally, because I talked about various songs of Sitala which are prevalent, which sing the glory of the goddess. I'll just mention one song. This is popular in the oral domain. It says, Sohor furibo ailok ahise jibodan magisu ami, nazani khumalu air fulbari, nisini singilu koli, ibaror dukhoke khemiba gokhani, mata soronot thori. Oh, the mother goddesses have come to roam about the city. We pray that our lives be spared. Unknowingly, we trespassed into the garden of the goddess. Inadvertently, we plucked a bud. Pardon us for our trespass, for this time, O Mother, we humbly lie at your feet. So as evident, these lines do reveal these paradoxical implications of division, of devotion towards Sitala. Now this notion of trespassing is also relevant here, since certain quotidian activities come under restriction. When a person is infected with Sitala, there are certain things that one cannot do. I had mentioned it, but maybe I'll skip that, how, you are not supposed, and also the patient is supposed to be offered cold food. The patient cannot be given hot or warm food. So there are certain rituals which have to be followed, and which are basically householder duties. Not that you have to observe those duties in the temple or do it ritualistically, but those are routinely followed as long as Sitala, her presence is there within the body. So anyway, so here I conclude. So while it is difficult to form a trajectory, I'm not saying that these influences have been derived from classical sources. What I'm trying to say, there is a symbiotic relationship between. I talked about the classical sources from the Skanda Purana and the Kalika Purana. I talked about the vernacular textual sources, and then I also talked about the Ainam, the songs, which are basically the oral performative sources. So across these three representative formats, we see a representation of Sitala, and I see those three formats as symbiotic, how they continually enrich each other, and towards that they form a kind of a very multi-medial cult of Sitala. And we could apply this theory elsewhere as well. This is not something endemic to Assam. We can theorize about such a possibility in other places as well. So even though it is not prolific as diverse as the Bengali Sitala Mangala Kavya, but Jairam Das's Sitala Panchali Kavya is significant text within the Tantric cultural ecological geography of medieval Assam. And from the various description of Sitala, including her iconography and its manifold significance, what we have seen, how her representation within the text of the divine feminine is based on an interface between the classical cosmopolitan Sanskrit, the Purana-centric literary culture on the one hand, and the folk, vernacular, localized interpretative traditions prevalent in Assam in the 18th century. And I've already talked about inward experiences and external worship practices. So I end with this prayer to Sitala. May she spare us all. May she keep her blessings on us. Namami Shitalang Devi Rasa Praste Digambarim Marjani Kalasopetang Swarpalakritang Mastakam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dhurjjati Sharma ji. As always, he presents rigorous, well-researched, well-presented papers. Always a role model for youngsters. You are an asset for us, Dhurjjati Sharma ji. Any